So we are a culture which openly prizes honesty and transparency, but we are actually incredibly dishonest and not at all transparent, where the thing about society today is that you're not supposed to talk about any of the issues. And that's absolutely insane. I think that porn has staved off the revolution by like 5 to 10 years. I don't think we would have made it that far without this. 80% of 18-year-olds are virgins now, and that would be unthinkable 5 years ago, let alone now.
Welcome back to the Reality-Based Podcast, guys. In this episode, I'm going to be interviewing one of my favorite YouTubers, Rudyard from What If Alt Hist. I've watched pretty much everything that he's released, and we talked about some very interesting topics today, including the coming incel revolution, a fascinating experiment called Mouse Utopia, which reflects our society, which he goes into detail about, and much, much more. Don't forget, guys, if you want to catch the Reality-Based Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube Music, you can do so. And while you're there, if you don't mind leaving us a 5-star review, that would be fantastic. So with that, if you're watching on YouTube, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Hope you guys enjoy this as much as I did. Without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, Rudyard, thank you so much for joining me on the Reality-Based Podcast, brother.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Love your channel. I actually discovered it just before one of my last appearances on the Whatever podcast. And my friend sent me your video, which was the coming incel revolution. And I found it absolutely fascinating because it kind of put into words the way that I was feeling about everything. And there were a lot of different moving pieces with the idea of this sort of building problem of incels in our generation, or you could say disaffected young men. So I think you do a brilliant job of that. Your videos are extremely well researched and very original in your ideas as well. So you should be really proud of your channel. And I ended up stealing a few of your points on that podcast, and then we connected and had a long chat on Zoom. So it's a pleasure to have you here today, man. I want to first start by talking about that video in particular, the coming incel revolution, and how did you come about that concept, and why do you think that this holds so much weight?
Thank you so much. You're too kind. The idea that I got it from, and that's a good question because it makes me go back through my own mental journey. After high school, I took a gap year, and my gap year, I'm from America, as you folks can probably ascertain. I'm from Pennsylvania, and I went to France and Peru. And what I noticed in both those places is that there were very similar issues to America. I was in France at the Yellow Vest protest, and so I was actually in the middle of a date, and then a block away, I heard an explosive go off. The downtown of the city I was in, it was nigh uninhabitable due to constant protests, where they would break into buildings, they'd stop people from functioning, and migration in that part of France had made a large part of the city, it was dangerous to walk through. So Americans, and I think other people in the Anglosphere, know the issues America has. France has got its own issues. And in Peru, they were about to elect a communist government that was pushing policies that would hurt Peru in a lot of ways. And then when Peru had COVID, they went complete totalitarian, where they didn't even let you leave your street. There were police patrolling the street so that you couldn't even go to a corner store during COVID. And it's funny, in a country where I think 40% of Peru is pre-industrial. So expecting a pre-industrial people who need to actually go out and work the land to survive and keeping them in their house, that's just insane. So I triangulated that this was a global issue, and I could tell from other areas like China or other parts of Europe that this is a global problem. But no one had explained or articulated what this underlying issue is. And one of the problems I find with a lot of history is that we don't have a wide enough vocabulary to talk about the issues we face, where we really don't have a historical vocabulary that goes back before World War II. In America, at least, we don't even think about World War I. The problem, though, is that the range of issues society can face is so vast that you need to have a longer frame of reference. And this will take me a while to get into. I could if you like, but I have a theory that one of the strengths of the Bible is that it was written over 3,000 years. So the Israelites hit every single social issue a society could hit, and thus they had a kind of playbook for how to deal with a variety of such circumstances. That notwithstanding, I read a book called The Great Wave by David Hackett Fisher when I was in France. And that book, it hit me like a bullet. And the thesis of the book, and it really got me down this whole rabbit hole, is that you can correlate inflation with revolutions. And so the author is legitimately one of the best historians of our time. He wrote a couple other books that are as brilliant. But the thesis of the book is that you can use inflation to predict when societies have revolutions, and they happen every 250 years. For previous examples being the French Revolution, the 30 Years' War, the Black Death, and you could go back for thousands of years. They happen like clockwork every 250 years. I went down this whole rabbit hole, and there's another author who took David Hackett Fischer. They took his ideas and then he developed a computer model that could predict these kinds of revolutions based off 3 underlying variables. And so from that, his computer model predicted in 2010 that the West would experience a revolution in the 2020s. And keep in mind, 2010 was a very different world from what we live today. If you called that in 2010, that requires a degree of foresight that almost no one had. But those books, and just looking at reality in the outside world, it really led me down this rabbit hole into believing that we are on the verge of a crisis like that.
Interesting. And so one of the things that I found very, very compelling about the video was the different historical examples that you gave where actually disaffected young men played no small part in the revolutions of the society. So if you don't mind going through a few of those examples.
Yeah. Most people view history in exactly the wrong intuitive way, and this is true of philosophy as well, where most people see philosophers as these really boring autistic people who just spend all their days in rooms and write about useless things. If you were to talk about Schopenhauer or Aristotle, I think that's the general public's comprehension. But the more philosophy you read, the more you realize these are absolutely insane people. And they talk about ideas that are still useful today. And for history is the same way, where the way we teach history is absolutely boring. It's just so, you've ripped the entire human drama out of it. And the reality, though, is that one of the things I like to say is that when you deal with history, understand that it was, to the people involved, equivalent to Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or Star Wars. There are certain periods of history that are far more dramatic and incredible than any story we could make up. And that's never how we convey it. And so I want to throw that out because I'm sure you've heard about a lot of these events, but you don't have a frame of reference for what it was like to live through at the time. And so there are 4 or 5 historic events that I use as proxies for our current era. And the way my mind works is I look at, these are the historic events that I have a underlying pattern for. And then I look at the future. And one of my favorite quotes, the things I constantly say, is I'm betting against God. And what that means is I don't know what's going to happen. I'm figuring it out. I will be wrong because we're all going to be wrong. But the 4 or 5 historic events I use as parallels, and then I see what events in the future fit them, are the English Civil War, the American Civil War, the French Revolution, and the fall of the Roman Republic. And I think for each of those events, there's enough parallels that it's scary.
Right. Okay. And so what are some of those parallels in particular?
What I find for all of these crises, and this is again what David Hackett Fischer and Peter Turchin study, is that there's 20 different correlative variables that you stack them together, and once you see those variables, you know you're going to have a revolution. And there's a couple like funny ones. For example, when the average age of marriage goes above 28, you're going to have a revolution. And that's been true historically. Alternately, average height going down is a really bad sign. But the underlying 3 causal variables, and you can plug these variables in to a computer model, and you'll see that societies hit revolutions based off these 3 variables. And this has worked dozens of times through Peter Turchin's work. Those variables being competition for elite jobs, inequality, and low average wages. And so what that means, as an example, is you look at the 1980s. Homer Simpson was a lower middle class loser. And that was the point of the show. Homer Simpson, he was a working class man. He had a stay-at-home wife, 3 kids, took vacations. Basically, no one in our age demographic can afford that stuff, even if they're significantly higher social class than Homer Simpson. And I'm pretty young, but I do remember Homer Simpson's America. It was around for glimmers of my childhood. So that was real, and it's completely gone. And the question you ask yourself is, how does that change everyone's assumptions? And it always shocks me, such rapid changes occur in our society, and yet no one talks about it. And the short answer that I could get into more detail if you'd like is I think it's that our elite derives their power from their ability to manipulate the population. And so they purposely control discourse to keep it within their parameters. So what happens when those 3 variables hit is that you've removed an incentive structure for cooperation. Every society has to provide incentive structures for you to work inside the system. And if you look at, let's say, 15 years ago, your average American loved America, and it's true across the Western world. They would never imagine like toppling the current government. That would be completely insane. But what happens and this is a whole process, and it's driven off population growth, actually. And something people don't realize is that the underlying variable that I think is causing these issues is a labor imbalance, because what we've done since the 1950s is that we have done literally everything we could do in order to get the value of labor to go down. We have the population itself has doubled through natural population growth. We imported women into the workforce. In America, we've imported 40 million immigrants. There's globalization. So there's been labor competition in places like Southeast Asia or Mexico. And then finally, there's automation, or removing humans from machines. And so all of these things have resulted in the demands for labor going ahead of labor by 40%. And what that means in the real world is that someone's money is becoming less and less worthwhile. And that's what happened in all of these historic trends. What happens then is that if the value of labor gets cheaper, the value of money gets stronger. Because if you can hire someone for very little money, what that means is that the people with the money can control those people, so inequality skyrockets. The end point of inequality skyrocketing is that you have a very small group of wealthy people and everyone else is dissatisfied, and the cost of living skyrockets. And so that's what happened to us, and it's what happened in those previous crises, where in the French Revolution, for example, everyone was dissatisfied. There was a small group of very, very wealthy people, and the monarchy was dissatisfied, the nobility were dissatisfied, the merchant classes were dissatisfied. So you hit this critical point where no one was happy with the system, so you could easily ask people to have a revolution, and then you hit instability. And so what happens when most people can't live, and then there's a small group of very wealthy people, is that the population naturally divides into multiple groups based off the self-interest to push their interests. And so these are normally based off ethnic or class or certain other interests that are motivated by ideology. In our society, it's the right and the left. And the right and the left, there's a couple proxies you can run, but they're basically the same thing. The left is low agency, feminine, and urban. The right is high agency, masculine, and rural. And so you could say cities versus countryside, men versus women. The one that I use the most is college-educated bureaucracy versus non-college educated non-bureaucracy. Everything the left pushes for gives the college-educated more jobs. Everything the right pushes for goes against the interests of the college-educated. So and you could go back through history with the whites and the reds in the Russian Revolution, the left and the right in the French Revolution, the Armagnacs and Burgundians in medieval France, the parliamentarians and the Cavaliers. And so what happens over time is that as the society stops working for people, you remove the incentive for cooperation, and thus society spirals into war. And from all of this, the thing that I'm most known for is my prediction that America will have a revolution within the next 5 years, and especially so the next year, because I've looked at all these variables. I don't think we can make it otherwise. And beyond that, I think that the most likely option is either a budget crisis, a presidential election crisis, or some kind of black swan, which is an event we can't predict, or a foreign war. I think one of those events will hit. One side refuses to give leverage over the other side since they're so tired of each other, and then a centralized government stops existing.
Right. Okay. So when we look at the current crisis that we're facing, and you've laid it out brilliantly there, why do you think it's accelerated so much, particularly over the last 15 years? Because you mentioned how different a world 2010 was. And I just remember, just as an example, when I used to go shopping with my dad as a kid, go to the supermarket, and the whole entire shopping would come out to $200-300. Nowadays, you can barely even fill up a little basket for that much. It's just crazy how different the cost of living is. So what particularly do you think has happened over the last 15 years to accelerate this?
That's a great question. The thing is that processes often build up over a long period of time, and then they hit an exponential point of no return. And so Peter Turchin, the author who's done the statistical models on this, he said in 2010, there's no way that this doesn't happen. It's like the Titanic, where once you see an iceberg, you've already hit it. And what occurred with us is that our current everything in our society, because certain eras create assumptions that make sense to said society, and then over time the universe wears down that assumptions, and for every system, as Aristotle said, it will naturally be pushed to its logical conclusion so that its greatest strengths become its greatest weaknesses. In our society, we exist in the World War era, where every single thing in our society is built off some assumption that was made around the time of World War I or World War II. And so that's how long these factors have been bubbling up under the surface. Everything that's destroying our society was some kind of deal that made sense in like the 40s or the 20s, and it's just stupid now, where for government welfare, it made sense when the average person died at age 66. Now, when the average person dies at 82, the welfare state, it just doesn't work anymore. Or the idea of obsession with various racial agendas, that made sense when America was a 90% white country. And it made sense when a third of the country was legally discriminating against black people. Or the education system. The education system made sense when everyone worked in a factory, because you're training for factory skills in the current education system, like waking up early, doing a job, precision. Now, when almost no one works in factories, the skills the schools teach are completely redundant. And so that's the case across our entire society. And so the starts of the variables that are hitting us now, they started around 1980. And I'm generally supportive of the neoliberal Reaganite Thatcher revolution, but that is the underlying start of this variable, where the globalization that came out of that time period is what caused the issues we're having now. But it would have happened anyway. These are natural demographic processes. The reason it happened in the last 15 years so bad is that once you hit a certain threshold, you end up with compounding effects. Whereas things get worse, they continue to get worse. And the last 15 years really saw the dissolution between the elites and the population, where I just read one of the best politics books in my life. It's The Revolt of the Elites by Lash. And the book there's a handful of books that are written decades ago, but they could be written today because the author exactly slams dunked the issues. And the thesis of the book is that he goes through education, he goes through politics, he goes through the military, he goes through everything. And he finds that the elites stopped caring about the well-being of the population. So he goes through the military, the education, the politics, and he says what's happening now is a small group of elites who are looking to extract value from the general population without general care for what happens to them. And that's what we really hit in the last 15 years. And even the last 4 years, I have become vastly more cynical about this stuff in the last even 2 years, the last year, because it became completely clear that people just don't care about the common good. It's all just extracting for your own tiny group. And that sort of loss of trust is exactly the kind of variable that pushes people over the edge. Because if you think the elites care about you, if you think the other political side sees you as people, you're going to give them at least some kind of kindness. But when you think the other side sees you as demons and you think the elite sees you as cattle, that's when the revolution starts.
Right. So, in terms of your view of liberal democracy, for example, the post World War II era that we live in, I think there's the one idea that was propagated in the 90s that we'd sort of reached the threshold, right? Like we'd sort of reached the pinnacle, right? The pinnacle of civilization, and we're there now, and every other country in the world needs to adopt this because liberal democracy is just the best. But your view on it is that just like every other system that's ever happened hitherto, liberal democracy also has its logical conclusion. And what we're seeing is not necessarily something extremely nefarious, but rather what we're seeing is just the logical conclusion. It's the compounding effect, because obviously
Yes.
the compounding graph, it just goes like this, and then once it hits critical mass and it just skyrockets. So you think that that's what we're seeing as opposed to something really nefarious and planned?
Yes, you stated that very well. And what I would say is that I say that our current philosophy is feminine materialism. And we can kind of see the issues of that in that the problem so around the 1960s, we removed a concept of moralization, where back 100 years ago, you were supposed to be earnest and kind and honorable and that stuff. And then as of now, we've completely removed we instated something I call mask morality, and mask morality is creating a moral code off very superficial social interactions. You're polite, you say the right pronouns, you use the right words, use the right political slogans, and that's our moral code. And the reason we did it is to create a front so that otherwise we could be completely immoral in other things. And that's what happened, where we removed a moral code. And once you remove a moral code, within a lifetime, you will get unimaginable evils. And that's where we
So
are
you
now,
don't
where
think that
our,
mask morality, because like mask morality, I get what you mean by that. It's like sort of
yeah,
virtue signaling in a sense.
yeah,
You think that mask morality in itself is not actually a sustainable form of morality that can guide our civilization.
no chance. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, there's no chance where Asia has Asia has a proxy where in Asian cultures they have face and shame. Where in Chinese culture, if you make your boss look bad in a meeting, that's an actively immoral thing in their culture. But China, they have Confucius, they have Buddha, they have like really strong family structures. The Chinese have built their entire civilization with mask morality as a component. And for us, it's just the whole thing. And in our society, we don't have a mechanism for saying if someone is wrong. That's the greatest taboo of our society, is judging someone else. But that's very explicitly insane, because once you do that, you're basically selecting for the absolute worst behaviors, because once you remove standards, you're going to get, imagine if you remove standards for your car. You're going to get some crappy car that doesn't even drive. And we've done that for morality.
Mm, yeah. So something else that was really interesting, I think I actually might have actually learnt this concept from one of your videos, but porn in itself is something that actually may have staved off the revolution for a number of years, because a lot of young dudes these days have literally no access to women. I mean, I don't think
Yeah.
I'm a bad candidate. I think I'm a decent looking guy, got a decent career going on, and all of these sorts of things. But, I get rejected all the time, man, like all the time. And I was watching one of your videos today where you referenced someone who described it as young women these days who are moderately attractive. It's like being hassled by what was it?
Yeah, so that's Alexander Grace. He's another Australian dating YouTuber. He's also a What If Altist fan. Alexander Grace, and so you're in Turkey, so you'll get this. In Turkey, you'll be walking. It's not as bad there as other countries, but when I was down in Mexico, I would be walking along a certain road, and 100 guys would hassle me to sell me their stuff.
Mm.
And past a certain range, it's just absurdly annoying. And for I think the most important point to convey to older people, because older people really, really don't get this. No one above the age of 35 understands how bad the mating crisis is. And I use the word mating crisis intentionally because it's dating, it's marriage, it's children, it's happiness between both sexes. It's this sense of that both sexes have social norms to which they understand each other. All those things are broken. And I like to tell older people, like Gen X or Boomer people, whatever you knew in 1970, we are operating at 5% of 100% of the functionality that you had in 1970. And that's just a heuristic I throw out. We're at 1/20th the functionality. And only by saying that can you explain to an older person how bad things have gotten. And I like because my worldview is I try to understand under what logical assumptions does the things someone do make sense? Because everyone is rational inside their own worldview. And so the way to explain how young women feel about the modern dating situation is that Myron Gaines from Fresh and Fit, he pulled it together, and he said that an attractive woman in a city will get 1,000 offers for sex a week. And so young women, they can get like 200 likes on dating apps every day, various like clubs or at work or whatever. And that's just not healthy. It's not what any of us evolved for. And I'd imagine explaining to a young man, imagine if you got 1,000 offers for sex a week. And statistically, if the dating apps were countries, and I'm sure you guys know this stuff already, but if dating apps were countries, Tinder would be the second most unequal country in the world, behind South Africa and ahead of Venezuela. Because in Tinder, 80% or 20% of men get 80% of the likes, and the top 5% of men get 40% of likes. So that's an absurd degree of inequality, because we found that once you give women infinite optionality, hypergamy kicks in.
Yeah. And it was such an interesting point about porn itself as well, because I never really thought about it this way. But when young guys have nowhere to turn sexually, I mean, ideally everyone waits till marriage and they get married and they have kids young and all of this, because that signals a healthy society. But that's just not the way that the modern world is, because we live in such a hypersexualized culture. And when we live in this such hypersexualized culture where status is everything, and where having a hot girl is everything, and we've got lots of male influencers who push this down the throat of young men that if you're not this and that, then you're a failure. When you do have the reality of the matter, which is that 90+% of young men have very little options under 25, because guys under 25 just aren't attractive for a starter. That's why they turn to porn so much. And that actually may have staved off this massive undercurrent of young guys who are just going to porn and self-destructing rather than going out into the streets and just wreaking havoc.
You're a good podcast host, so I want to compliment you on that. You do a good job of structuring the questions and moving from one topic to another.
Thanks,
but
bro.
From what you said, I think that porn has staved off the revolution by like 5 to 10 years, where I don't think we would have made it that far without this. And what you say is all true. We're guys under 25. For I think guys in their early 20s, there was a new statistic that came out where 80% of 18-year-olds are virgins now. And that would be unthinkable 5 years ago, let alone now. And my estimate is that 80% of 21-year-old guys are single, which is because it's 2/3 for the 30 to 18 demographic. And I've seen other statistics that skews older. So if, let's say, half of guys who are 29 are single, then it would be 80% among guys who are 21. And so that's absolutely horrifying. And it's crazy to read eyewitness accounts of World War I and World War II, where you hear about these 21-year-old soldiers. And the crazy thing is they're all married and they have 2 kids. Imagine being a 21-year-old, you're married, you have 2 kids, you're a manager at your local factory. And it's funny that we envy our ancestors 100 years ago, because that's not something that the end of history, it actively pushes against that. And yeah, I think porn has definitely delayed this, because humans are crazy monkeys, and we don't have we're not rational by any means. And one of my favorite quotes I use is that humans were designed to breed first and be rational later. And the thing is that this is a crisis that I think is of incredible importance that you can't talk about anywhere. It's completely taboo to discuss. And I find that insane because you would think for the ruling class that it's their self-interest to survive, but they're so complacent that they don't even realize the calculation they're making without even realize they're making it. And it's crazy to see what the internet does to sexuality, because for the internet, it's done multiple things. It's given men infinite access to seeing very intimate parts of women that they would never have. There was a lot of porn back in the pre-industrial world. Like, one of the things people don't realize is that Victorian England had an insane amount of prostitution and porn. Well, it was also a very sexually prude society, but it's nothing comparable to what we're seeing today. This is just historically unprecedented. And also, it gave women infinite sexual options. So what the internet did was it allowed the globalization of the dating market in multiple ways. And it's crazy where I think Michael Sartain said that back in the day, the most attractive girl in Wichita, Kansas would marry a local banker. Now she's being flown out to Los Angeles to party with a guy who runs a music studio that cuts records. And that's the sort of thing where you end up with mass imbalances. And the imbalances are both true for both porn and dating markets, because you're removing the problem is that we need to have cultural barriers that we don't have. That's true across the internet, where back in high school, I saw kids constantly on their phones. And like we had a school dinner and everyone was on their phone. Everyone was staring at the screen. And I thought, like, how is this? Why don't they feel shame that, like, weren't they raised as children to not use their phones at the dinner table? But no, I think that's a useful symbol that it's when you first gave the Native Americans alcohol, they would drink all day and it would destroy the communities, because the Native Americans, when they first got whiskey, they had no parallel to it. And because they just, in our society, we have a concept: you don't drink before 5 p.m., you're not drunk on the job, but you have to have time to get things like that. And you have to have time people who are the complete alcoholics die out of the gene pool. And so that's us for phones. And I don't think people understand that, where I catch myself at least one day a week spending all day on phone. I think to myself, this is completely unhealthy, but we have no social institutions for this. We don't have phone alcoholic groups. We don't have workplaces or schools where you have to put your phone in a box beforehand. And John Haidt had a really interesting book about this, where I think just compounded, the internet is such an atom bomb on a social basis that we just have no frame of reference on how to deal with it.
Mm. It's so true, man. And I find myself like all the time checking my phone way too early in the morning and spending way too much time on my phone. But I also do try and get out and like leave my phone and go and actually do things. But in a world where loneliness is so abundant, you can completely understand why a young person without the self-discipline that is built over a number of years of just developing yourself would just get sucked into that trap.
Yes.
But loneliness is something that is, in my opinion, one of the biggest epidemics. And all of these little sub issues like porn and OnlyFans and that sort of thing, and like, you know, young men who are becoming more violent and who are becoming, you know, extremists in various different ways. I think it all stems from the loneliness problem, because we don't have places to go, and young men want to be a part of a group and a gang, and socialization is so necessary and important. And I think this kind of bleeds into the next idea of the mouse utopia, which is something that you talk about regularly on your channel, which is a fascinating science experiment that happened. So I'd like to hear a little bit about mouse utopia and how you think that experiment really speaks to some of the issues that we're facing today.
I'm going to get to that, but you brought up an interesting thread that I was thinking about, where The irony is that everything's also its opposite. So we are a culture which openly prizes honesty and transparency, but we are actually incredibly dishonest and not at all transparent. Where the thing about society today is that you're not supposed to talk about any of the issues, where the dating crisis, loneliness, inequality, financial issues, lack of religion, all the issues that touch a person on a personal level, you're not allowed to discuss. And that's absolutely insane because it means you can't talk about anything in your life. And we pick culture war issues as a way to symbolically vent how pissed off we are. But for example, the loneliness crisis, that's going to kill society if we don't fix it, but you'll never hear someone talk about it. And I think it's a real lack of maturity where people don't want to talk about things that make them feel vulnerable as individuals because we're not a very mature culture. So we act intellectually like children and we project our personal problems onto others. That being said, Mouse Utopia is fascinating, and realizing this study changed my life. Where, yeah, Mouse Utopia was a study that was run about 30 times in the 60s and the 70s, and the thesis of it is that this was around the era when the world's population was jumping from 2 billion to 8 billion. And for obvious reasons, people were scared about what the ramifications of population growth like that would be. So the test is you put 9 mice in a big cage that is space to hold 6,000 mice, and you give them perfect conditions: infinite room, infinite food, infinite no diseases, perfect climate. What happens? And the results for each experiment are exactly the same, in that the mouse population balloons from 9 to 2,000. Then what happens is that the mice start to go absolutely crazy. And the interesting thing is that there are multiple subcategories of mice. Almost as if when Mouse Utopia hits, you're given a choice for one way to go crazy or the other. One being, it's funny that the guy who ran the experiment, Calhoun, he calls the mice autistic. And autism wasn't the buzzword that it is today. In the 60s, it was a clinical medical term. The irony, though, is that the rise of autism, because one of the interesting tangents I could throw out is that mental illnesses change radically over history. We have very few pre-industrial records of schizophrenia or autism, but autism rates skyrocketed since the 60s, and that kind of proves his thesis. But you had a group who became antisocial and autistic. You had the beautiful ones, or mice who would groom themselves all day but not breed. You had everyone lost belief, everyone lost interest in mating, and the mouse birth rate completely crashed. And that's fascinating in that, so for our birth rate, we have computer models to predict the decline in birth rate. What's happened is faster than the fastest computer models possibly guessed, which is absurd. And the thing is, most computer models have an absurdly large standard deviation. And so what that means is the scenario we are living through crashing birth rates is something that is just outside the bounds for what we thought was possible. And that's scary. But go back to the point. We have autistic mice, beautiful ones mice. Female mice lost interest in breeding, and they would not associate with males. They became very isolated and lonely. You had male mice who became sociopaths who would kill other mice for fun. You had mice who would wander around the colony as homeless, and they let other mice hurt them. And you had other mice who were just, so there's a whole spectrum from angry to numb to luxury. And so all of the bad things, mouse colony broke down. And then what happened each time is the mouse colony the numbers crash from 2,000 mice to 0 because none of the mice have children, and the mice lose the ability to cooperate socially. And it's funny to talk about mice society in the same way that we would talk about the fall of the Mayans or the fall of the Romans. But apparently mice do have a society based off culture, and thus it really worries me for obvious reasons. I see everything in Mouse Utopia, and what I said in my video on the topic, and the Mouse Utopia video, it's one of my favorite videos. If you guys want to start watching my show, Mouse Utopia would be one of the best ones to start with. I say that for look at climate change, and I don't really have a position on climate change. It's something that I assume would require decades of study to actually get right, and I just don't have that information. What I say is that Miami hasn't sunk beneath the ocean. Denmark hasn't sunk between the ocean. But every single thing in Mouse Utopia has already happened. Every single variable you see in Mouse Utopia, we can see in human society now. There's none that don't fit.
Right. So when you look at Mouse Utopia, the experiment is, as you said, that they had 9 mice, and the mice population blossomed into a 2,000 mice population, and all seemed to be going well. But then it hit a certain point where the population then started to decline. And then what was synonymous with the population decline was this sort of fracturing of the mice culture and community. Yeah. And why was it every single time that happened at that specific point?
That's a good question, because it leads me to two other themes that I was going to get to. One of which is that the reason I believe in Mouse Utopia is that what I constantly do is I look for historic parallels in current society, and I try to figure out which of these things I'm seeing now can be explained by a historic parallel. And a lot can be explained by historic parallels, but there's a couple things that really don't have said parallels. Examples of which are nihilism. And societies normally go through something called decadence. And decadence is when society gets so wealthy, it loses the ability to function. So it happened for the Romans, it happened with the Arabs, it happened with the Chinese, the Indians, the French for their revolution, and it's happening to the West now. And in decadence, societies lose the ability to fight, they lose interest in breeding, they lose religion, they lose unifying, they lose class unity, they lose social trust, because when society gets wealthy enough, you no longer have an incentive to try hard. So the society decays, and then what normally happens is that the society gradually gets weaker, and then barbarians show up and then burn everything down. So that's the thing that happens over history, and it fits with Mouse Utopia, where in Mouse Utopia, and keep in mind, the mouse brain structure is relatively similar to the human brain structure, in which we share the amygdala, which is the emotional brain, and the lizard brain. Well, the thing that separates humans is the ability to think rationally and to store data, that being the prefrontal cortex. So with mice and humans, the same thing is neurologically happening to us, but humans have a better ability to rationally understand it and to plan around it than the mice do. So you give people infinite prosperity, they stop trying, that makes sense. The thing where Mouse Utopia gets in is that the decadence of previous societies is unparalleled to our society in Mouse Utopia. The post-World War II West is the wealthiest society in history by such a significant margin that it seems to be that it's completely changed the dynamic, in which nihilism is a great example. There are no suicidal societies over history. And I think it's obvious to those who want to see that our society is suicidal, in that and this is something that's difficult for people to emotionally process, but it's still true. We print infinite money. We're bringing in immigrants for the express purpose of destroying the West, not because it's an economic benefit. We are pushing anti-Western stuff in the school curriculum. We're smearing our own history. We're destroying every single cultural tradition we have. And thus, so the end point of this is suicide. It's not exploiting the society for financial benefit. I think the last couple of years of woke corporations has demonstrated they're doing this even when it's against their financial self-interests. And that's really terrifying. And if you look at the previous decadent societies like the Romans or the Arabs, you find that decadent societies they sort of lose the desire for life. But we're on a completely different scale. And in addition to that, the scale by which the birth rate is crashing is so scary, and it's only paralleled in Mouse Utopia, where, for example, the Greeks or the Romans, their birth rates went into decline once they got wealthier. But it's nothing like the statistics we're seeing now, where for every 100 Koreans alive today, there will be 4 at the end of this century if trends continue. And that is only Mouse Utopia. And that's what scares me so much about it.
So when you look at Mouse Utopia, the interesting part there is once the birth rate declines, which is sort of where we're at right now, like you just brought up the example of South Korea, and all Western countries have a declining birth rate. I think the only one that could be considered Western, I don't really consider it a part of the West, but it's Israel, who has a higher birth rate than the other countries. Everyone else's birth rate is in decline, and in most cases in free fall. So once that happens, and then you look at the Mouse Utopia experiment, if you want to draw the parallel, do you see the fracturing of the different parts of culture as we're seeing now?
Yes, great point. The That's exactly what's happening. Every single fracturing in Mouse Utopia is happening now. We have the autists. The beautiful ones are either like K-pop stars or like gym bros who are only obsessed with lifting and they don't actually want to use it to get married and have kids. Then you have the nihilistic mice. That's the left. You have the bloodthirsty nihilistic mice, which I think is factions of the right who I say that there's a certain faction of the right where everything they say is a rationalization for killing people. You have degenerate mice. I mean, there's a lot of hedonism and degeneracy in our society. And you see political factionalization and cultural factionalization. And one of the very interesting things of the 20th century that we don't give any credit for, the 20th century saw the establishment of a global monoculture that doesn't exist elsewhere in history. In the 20th century, everyone listened to Frank Sinatra or Queen. They wore blue jeans. They ate hamburgers. It's this Americanized global monoculture, but in becoming globalized, it started to hate America. And so 21st century, that's dead. And an example of this, I love pop music. I follow pop music. But we kind of stopped having pop music after the Trump presidency. Post 2016, the only two new pop singers are Olivia Rodrigo and Dua Lipa, and they've only had one successful album. And what that signifies to me is the death of a shared unified culture. Because, for example, I have a very wide taste in music. My favorite band is Mongolian Buddhist heavy metal. I listen to some country music. I listen to some pop music. But
so
now
Mongolian Buddhist heavy metal.
Yes,
you're gonna have to send me some links to that because it sounds like some good gym music.
Yeah, it goes really hard. I love them so much. But
okay, great.
I'm listening to that. I'm not listening to the Hot 100. So the Hot 100 has stopped existing as a cultural form because everyone is listening to their version of Mongolian Buddhist metal. And it's partly driven by the internet, it's partly driven by Mouse Utopia. But I think the onus at this point is that if we're fracturing and we're going to have all these different sub-communities, then we have to pick the good ones and not the bad ones. Where I think of someone, like I have a sister who's very left-wing. And between she and I, because we're in different algorithmic rabbit holes, they've become completely different cultures, where back in the day, everyone watched the news together. Everyone watched the same 3 TV shows. And so even for someone who's your family or lives in your town, you have those shared assumptions. But now, people in our social circle, they watch shows like this. Well, meanwhile, another person would watch the Young Turks, or about a third of the population statistically they don't care about politics. They watch, I don't know, like daytime TV, and they watch Mr. Beast and that stuff. So we've segmented into different sub-demographics of the population, which is partly bad, but it also allows said demographics, if they try hard enough, to vastly excel what the global monoculture of a century ago, of a generation ago, was doing.
Let me just piggyback on that thought for a moment, because I just had this idea that in terms of the global structure that we're looking at, and especially the Western structure, when you look at the collapse, if we are looking at some sort of impending doom, some sort of collapse that is coming, the cultural dynamics that we're seeing could be a microcosm of that, in the sense that we're seeing almost this anarchist type culture where there's all of these different subgroups forming, and people have their own subgroups, and then they're completely detached from the person who's a part of a different subgroup on the other side of the political spectrum. I was covering a debate about a year ago where Matt Taibbi and Douglas Murray were debating against Malcolm Gladwell. And Matt Taibbi was saying that everybody used to watch Walter Cronkite. Everybody used to kind of just respect Walter Cronkite, and everybody used to watch him. But nowadays, everything is so fractured. So, in terms of the broader implications of this, could this sort of more like anarchist, tribal, cultural fracture that we've been seeing reflect into what we might see in the bigger picture?
Oh yeah, definitely. And lots of people will naturally want to be nostalgic for the older day. And an irony is that I'm pretty conservative now, but when I was a teenager, I loved John Oliver. I loved watching SNL. And that's fascinating because it implicitly shows that there used to be this monoculture that tilted left, but this still the entire society consumed it. And I thought to myself as a teenager, I should watch more network TV news to be better informed about the world. And that's a joke today. No one would ever think that today. And so a lot of people would naturally be nostalgic for the old days. And I think they're really nostalgic for how prosperous the old days were, because a lot of that stuff was very cancerous and very bad, but it wasn't in a way people noticed. Where the old network TV world, it really pushed lowest common denominator, because when you're selling to the entire population, most people are not particularly moral or intelligent or any of those things. So you sell them on hedonism, you sell them on the abdication of responsibility, on degeneracy. And it's crazy to look at the TV era. When the TV era is World War II until, let's say, now, we've moved into the internet era since COVID. But TV era, it really had these very rapid social changes for very negative aims. Where if you look at the moral change of society from World War II until 2020, it was straight down. But we won't come to terms with that. And what we have now is much more comparable to the rest of history, where America 100 years ago, this is something interesting reading older American history. If you read a history of America written before World War II, they don't treat America as a single country. They treat America as an ethnic federation of lots of little countries. They say the Yankees are like this, the Southerners are like this, etc. Because in that society, there were these significantly stronger regional cultures. And that was true even in France. You had dozens of dialects and you had loads of different local forms. And I think that's a vastly more healthy system in which you can actually do stuff that relates to you as an individual. Because the problem with the TV world is that we all had to fit into this box of what the networks thought the average person was. But that's incredibly depersonalizing. And I think it's why we are so depressed and lonely today, that all of our cultural forms were invented by this elite to sell us stuff. And the elite knows nothing about us. They're selling this to people in Indonesia too. But with the digital culture, you can establish things that are tailored to your personality and who you are as an individual. The problem implicit in that is that it's trans-regional. If 200 years ago you were part of like Picardy in France, everyone in your area, you had similar life conditions. The problem with the internet world is it's very difficult to get Star Trek fans. You can't form a community around Star Trek fans. And so the next obvious question that we have to figure out is, if people are spending their lives online, how do you organize people remotely?
So one of the things that I just can't get away from is back to the idea of the incel revolution. We've talked about a lot of different issues plaguing our current culture at the moment, but when I look at the issue of the young men, I can't help but to think to myself, I mean, when I was 19, I was like way overweight, about 30 kilos overweight, and just I used to spend all my time indoors playing video games, eating bad food, just like watching porn, doing all of those terrible things. And young guys are just so susceptible to that sort of thing until they develop themselves and get more towards their sort of 30s, I would say. And with the current climate, we've got lonely, sex-starved, single guys with a cost of living crisis that are like essentially broke and lonely. Most guys are going to be broke and lonely. So, I mean, it's the one thing that I grapple with at the moment that I can't even comprehend what that is going to mean in the future. So, when you're looking at future predictions, how do you think this turns out?
Yeah. That makes me think of an interesting study, or I've seen a couple of studies that say the way the population works is that 20% of people are amoral sociopaths who will rip off others whenever they can. 20% of people are good people who want to help. And then 60% do whatever the crowd says. And there's interesting studies that show that if you can get the group consensus to change, 60% of people immediately change their thoughts. And that's scary. And what it demonstrates is that once you change the assumptions people believe, most people will just immediately change with them. And I was thinking about that because what you're saying, and this is totally true, is that the reason young men they do all those negative things is because that's the path they're given by society. So the attempt to make themselves excellent, that's something they have to go on a journey as individuals. But most people don't want to do that, or they have no interest in doing so. And what I would say to your question is that if a situation doesn't make sense, it's not going the way you think. So if you add all the assumptions up, and this is something where I've debated a lot of guys in the red pill space about this, where people like to think that everything's going to get worse. Where we are now is what the future is going to be like. You just need to adapt to the current dating climate. But the problem, though, the current dating climate and the current lifestyle is so toxic, it can't survive another 5 years, let alone another 100 years, because it's when a system doesn't make sense, it breaks down. And that's where we're at, where we're in a place where our system is so broken, it's going to break down. The next question is, what direction does it go into after? And if you look at history, there are certain points where hinge moments happen, where slight variations at that time determine the course of the entire history for centuries. And we're going to hit one of those, where choices we make now determine what the future is going to look like. And it's scary, but it's also thrilling, and it's also fun to think about that. And if you can't win a game, break the game or play a different game. And so you stack it's easy to mentally add up all these things are bad. You add up all the things that are screwing young men over, and then you think it's just going to keep going. But then once you add up all the factors of the equation, you end up in a different equation. And that's why I think we're going to have a revolution, because for so many young people, there's just, as of now, they're screwed. And so their incentive is to actually roll the dice. Because if they're screwed now, even if they roll the dice and die, that's a better chance of succeeding.
And I also think that they're much more inclined to get involved with politics. I think that the next generation, what have we got right now, like Gen X, Zoomers type thing?
Yeah,
I think
alpha.
that the alpha is going to be more radical, because
Yeah.
young guys, if they're not having, if they don't have access to a solid dating market, if they don't have access to good jobs and a good standard of life, and if they're all sort of coming together on the internet and realizing, hey, are you getting screwed over? I'm getting screwed over. We're all kind of getting screwed over here. They're going to mobilize politically. And I wouldn't necessarily be thrilled to see a massive party of people who are below 30 coming to some form of power, because people below 30 aren't very wise. But so how do you think this is going to reflect politically? And do you see this happening over the next sort of decade or so, where there is actually a mobilization of young men in particular politically?
Yes. I don't have a good prediction for Europe or Australia, so I'm operating off America. And what I see in America is that the leftist elite is completely delusional. They don't see anything. And it's really shocking, because I have a couple different avenues to look into this. And if you told them all of this, it just wouldn't register. And I look at the World Economic Forum, and the things they say, they have no comprehension of how insane it sounds to the general public. Or you look at the release with the press statements the government releases. The current elite is so detached, and frankly, very few people like them. So I think if there's a revolution, the current ruling class is wiped out very quickly. And you look at the left, the right has advantages and ability to use force. It has a more warlike culture. Most of the men in the military tilts right. Most gun owners tilt right. The police tilts right. The right has a coherent geography. It's where all the resources come from. It's where the electricity comes from. So the right holds all the cards. And there might be some variable I'm miscalculating here, but the right has
It's like the elephant on the chain, isn't it, in a way?
Exactly, yes. And so the left doesn't realize this. So the left keeps on egging the right on without the realization that the right has the complete ability to crush them. And that's why I think we'll have a revolution, that you have a dissatisfied group that can't live a normal life, who have all the physical force, versus an arrogant, delusional elite that keeps egging them on, but doesn't realize how weak it is. And so that's what I see happening. The left will get wiped out. The next question is, I think the right will spiral into local warfare, where there is no unifying ideal in the right. If you look at current rightist circles, it's libertarians, it's fascists, hardcore Christians, Nazis, normal conservatives, boomer cons. There's like 10 factions on the right that really share nothing. So that works when the purpose of the right is to push back the left. The problem then is that once the right has power, they can't decide anything. So I think the most likely option is that the left gets crushed, then the right spirals into warlordism, where you see different cults of personality around different right-wing ideas. And so what happens is that these young guys, they form different political factions based off their interests. And I think they're going to end up like killing each other.
Right. Interesting. You know that meme where it says, pick your direction, young man, and it has like the fork in the road? This is the
Yeah.
way that I think about that, right? When I think that we're at that fork in the road at the moment with it's all coming to a head. And on one side, I see the sort of pacified gimp version of man. And then on the other side, I see the more sort of revolutionary type of path. So if people just become so numb through porn and through AI and automation and video games and all these sorts of things, we could see vast swaths of the population that are actually just numb and immobile, basically, and
Yes.
like massive amounts of people. If this next generation is, if this is how the next generation goes, but then on the other side, if it goes the other way, we could see vast amounts of the population actually mobilize and really get involved politically. Those are the
Yes.
only two options I really see. And I think that you kind of described the option where people mobilize, but do you think that the option where people actually just become numb and everyone gets their universal basic income and they get their Starbucks delivered by a drone to their house and the liberal elites sort of just keep power?
The way I could see the scenario, the second scenario you described, is Mouse Utopia, where if we removed Mouse Utopia, I would put no chance on the second scenario you put. However, Mouse Utopia is changing enough assumptions of human nature that I could see it happening. I I would say it's less likely, given that we've hit, if all the factors we're describing had another 5 years where we hit a political crisis, I could see that. But I think people are so emotional now that you can't bottle it up anymore.
Mm.
And I would guess that the pacification scenario, if there's a civil war and the left wins and the left totally crushes the right, and then the left has purges of conservative young male leadership, you're ending up with that scenario. If there's, or in countries where the left totally dominates, because the left can't be nice to young men, because if they're nice to young men, it destroys all the myths under which their coalition is built. And yeah, another thing I'll throw out here is that if you look at these previous revolutions or civil wars, most people don't want to fight. Most people don't want there to be a war. Before the English Civil War, it was widely said that the English had grown too weak to fight because it had been over a century since England had had a war. But what happens in almost all these cases is most people are apathetic. Small groups of radicals seize power and they conscript normies. Because the problem is the normies don't organize, where no one says, I'm going to riot for normies, we're going to have a normie convention. And so you have this huge part of the population. But when bad things happen, they don't organize. And so their voice doesn't really matter. Meanwhile, if you look at these revolutionary time periods, the Jacobins were something like 1% of France's population. The Jacobins are the people who won the French Revolution. The Bolsheviks were also like 1% of Russia's population. The Puritans who won the English Civil War, they were 10% of England's population. And the Nazis went from complete obscurity to again, they were a social club Hitler invented or he didn't invent them. He just showed up afterwards. They were a social club in Munich that Hitler took over when it was like a dozen people, and he led them to national dominance. And so Nassim Taleb has got this point of skin in the game, that small groups of radicals control the game because they have the willpower to actually play. And so what I would see in our time is that most people don't want the war. What happens is that you see a breakdown of incentives in which, for the scenario I normally run off, is that the US has a budget crisis, and then rather than solving it, red and blue states say that they are the one true government. The red states form a new capital in Austin, change the budget, and they both claim to be the one true American government. So it's legally nothing's changed, but de facto you have two different governments. So what would happen then is that the radicals inside each camp just conscript people, where in the English Civil War, most English didn't want to fight. So what happened was that the royalists and the parliamentarians, they would just drag guys off the bar floor and go into random villages and say, you're in the army now. And I think
Ukraine,
that's
eh?
a likely scenario.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Exactly. Ukraine.
Bit like the Ukraine situation, exactly. Last thing I wanted to cover with you, Rudy, you've been making a few waves on Twitter today. You were calling Nick Fuentes a Fed, and then he got back to you and said, I think he said something, I think it was on like 2.4 million impressions last time I saw it.
Yeah,
that post.
It's hitting up against 3 million now. That
Yeah.
surprised me. And so I've had the idea that Nick Fuentes is a Fed in my mind for like 4 months. It's been something that's batting around. I didn't really want to, I didn't think about sharing it. But yeah.
Can I just quickly give you the counter argument?
Yes.
So that you can address the points. So the way I see it is that I think that he is somebody who's like has been as staunch a Trump supporter as you could possibly imagine in just in his journey from 2016 or whatever, from when he was in university. If you look at his story, he was doing debates back in the day where he was debating these liberals about Trump, and really when it was not popular to do. And he's somebody who's really bled for the cause, you might say. And now the Trump campaign maybe looks a bit different to him. It's not perhaps how he wouldn't align with it as much. And it's sort of like a scorned lover in a way. That's the way I sort of see it. It's like a scorned lover. And he says, you used to be different. Now you've gotten lazy, you've gotten soft and this and that. But you tend to, you actually seem to think, because I know that you wouldn't just throw this out there, but you actually think that he's a genuine Fed.
Yeah, I think that. I think there was a change around January 6th where so I don't know. I don't have the data. I didn't expect this to get millions of views. So what I would say is that I think there was a shift around Jan 6th. From what I can put together, I see the same shift that you do. And my guess is that I think he's a genuine conservative. I think he believes the things that he does. I think that he got a kind of deal around J6 that he could continue to have his platform in exchange for doing a couple things for doing some things for the regime. And so I think he's genuinely a conservative. But I think the reason I said this is that he makes strategic calculations that don't make sense otherwise from his self-interest. And the reason I replied to it was he said he prefers Kamala Harris to Trump. And there was just a snap in me where I thought to myself, this doesn't make sense. Because the way my mind works is I go into someone's head and I think, with your self-interest, with your background, what calculations would I make in your shoes? And the thing that makes it suspicious to me is that he does so much targeting inside the right of people who should be his coalition allies that it doesn't look like I don't understand why the decisions he makes are in his strategic self-interest under the incentives that he provides. Does that make sense?
I think that it does make sense. However, I think that one of the things that is so entertaining about him and why he has such a magnetism with young guys is that he's so unpredictable. Like even his super chatters that send him money, he just like roasts the shit out of them the whole time. And it's just, even the people who are providing you money, and there's nobody who's safe. So when people watch a guy like him with sort of normie commentators, I think normally you can sort of you can expect what they're going to say, but with him, you just never ever know. He could just launch a grenade and say, Kamala 2024. So I think that that's maybe a part of the allure of why people enjoy his content. Maybe he's clued on to that, and he's just such a contrarian to the nth degree.
Yes. The problem is that when you get to this degree of, you don't know who a person is, and once you get to this degree of fluidity, you're operating off things that can't be proven either way. And it's really, it's strange. You would think that, yeah, I just don't know what else to say. It's strange. I mean, if you guys want to see the argument, I've made the argument. There's no way to prove it either way. And so you can look at the data and draw your conclusions, but when all's said and done, we don't really know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Rudy, I would love to have you back on at some point to do a debate. I've got debates happening on the channel pretty regularly, hopefully in the future. So if is there any particular topic? Would you like to debate red pill guys, conservative guys?
I'd be interested. Yeah, hit me up when you're down for it. I could probably, there's a variety of different topics I could cover. I'm relatively moderate on the red pill in that I see guys across that spectrum and I can empathize with all of them. But yeah, think of whatever guest you think I would do a good job with.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, Rudy, thank you so much, man.
Thank you so much. Peace.